like Nelly.
Nelly.
I'm good, man. 6K. You rock your shit.
Jahmyr Gibbs just got crowned the best player in all of football, and the Detroit Lions are about to be unstoppable. Detroit, get ready, because today we've got news that is going to make every single Lions fan stand up out of their chair and start screaming at their television. This is the kind of news that validates everything. I mean everything we have been saying about this team all off-season long. Two separate reports dropped within days of each other, and both of them are basically shouting the same thing from the rooftops. The Detroit Lions are loaded, they are dangerous, and they might just be the team that goes from worst to first in the entire NFL this year. So buckle up, because we're diving deep into why Jahmyr Gibbs was just named the #1 fantasy football player on the planet, why the offensive line might be the most underrated unit in the league, and why a national outlet just put the Lions at the very top of their worst to first countdown. This is a lot to get through, so let's not waste another second. Let's start with the headline that has Honolulu Blue running through everybody's veins right now. PFF just released their top 300 fantasy football rankings and sitting at #1 overall, ahead of Bijan Robinson, ahead of Christian McCaffrey, ahead of Ja'Marr Chase, ahead of every single skill player in the National Football League is Detroit's own Jahmyr Gibbs. Let that sink in for a second. We are talking about a running back who is now considered the single most valuable fantasy asset in the sport. And the reasoning behind it is exactly what you'd expect if you've been paying attention to this offense. Gibbs is a close second for the top overall spot, similarly ranked in the top 5 each of the last 2 seasons, with a top 12 run-blocking offensive line, and everyone on that line under contract for next season. But here's the juicy part, the part that makes this whole thing feel like destiny. David Montgomery is no longer a factor weighing down Gibbs' workload, and if Montgomery's absence plays out the way people expect, Gibbs could be in store for a serious bump in rushing touchdowns. That's right, folks, the tandem is officially broken up. Sonic no longer has to share the backfield with a bruiser, and now the entire offense runs through this electric, all-purpose weapon. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Fantasy football and real football are not the same thing. And you're right, they're not. But think about what fantasy scoring actually measures. It measures touchdowns, yards, catches, and points. It measures whether a player does everything a coaching staff could possibly ask of him. And when the analytics community looks at Jahmyr Gibbs and says, this is the best player in football for our purposes, what they're really saying is that this man can do absolutely everything. He can go get 70 yards on one snap out of the backfield. He can catch passes at an elite clip. He can pound it between the tackles when the situation calls for it. And on top of that, Gibbs is in the conversation for the top overall pick in fantasy drafts, with people specifically pointing to how he was used at the end of last season as the reason for the excitement. Since in the second half of last season, his workload jumped up significantly compared to the first half. That's not a fluke. That's the coaching staff realizing what they have and building the entire operation around it. And speaking of building around him, this is where things get really spicy because Dan Campbell himself came out and made a declaration that Lions fans have been waiting years to hear. Campbell flat out said Gibbs is going to be the team's bell cow now, that they're going to hang their hat on him quite a bit, that they're going to do a lot of things they feel like he does well, and that Gibbs can run every single scheme that anybody has ever run at this level. Think about that phrase for a second. Bell cow. That is a title reserved for the workhorses of this league, the guys who take over an offense and never leave the field. And when you combine that with the fact that the Lions only spent a modest 1-year deal worth just over $1.5 million on Isaiah Pacheco as the backup, it tells you everything about how little Detroit actually expects to use anybody not named Jahmyr Gibbs. This is a coronation. Now let's talk about why this shift is happening and why it's such a big deal. For years, the story in Detroit was Sonic and Knuckles, Gibbs and Montgomery, the speed guy and the power guy, splitting carries and complementing each other beautifully. And look, that worked. It worked really well. But there was always a sense that Gibbs was being held back just a little bit, that his role was capped because the team wanted to keep Montgomery involved and keep both backs fresh. Well, that entire dynamic is gone. Montgomery has been shipped out, and now the only thing standing between Gibbs and an absolutely monstrous season is health. Nothing else. The touches are his. The targets are his. The goal line work is his. And when you have a player with his kind of explosiveness getting that kind of volume, you're talking about a potential MVP caliber campaign, not just a great fantasy season. But this is where the second piece of news comes in, and honestly, it might be even more important than the Gibbs ranking because it explains why all of this is even possible in the first place. A major national outlet just released their rankings of which teams around the league have the best chance to go from worst to first in their respective divisions, and sitting comfortably near the very top of that list are your Detroit Lions. Now for context, some of the teams on these worst to first lists come from divisions where literally every team stinks, where it's basically a coin flip because nobody in that division is any good. That's not the case here. The NFC North has been one of the most competitive divisions in the entire NFL, and for the Lions to be pegged as a favorite to leap back to the top of that pile after a disappointing finish says a lot about how much national respect this roster still commands. And the reasoning behind that prediction is fascinating because it's centered almost entirely around two things: the transformation of the offensive line and, you guessed it, Jahmyr Gibbs stepping into a bigger role. The article specifically says that if Penei Sewell's transition to left tackle goes smoothly, if Blake Miller steps in at right tackle and plays up to his first-round billing, if Cade Mays solidifies the center position, and if the young guards Christian Mahogany and Tate Ratledge continue to improve, then the Lions offense will get back to its explosive, high-flying ways. And then the article goes even further, stating outright that the player who could put the Lions over the top is Jahmyr Gibbs, who profiles to play a Christian McCaffrey-type role following the David Montgomery trade. Yahoo Sports. There's that comparison again, and it keeps popping up everywhere you look. Christian McCaffrey, one of the most dominant, do-it-all backs of this entire generation. That is the tier people are now placing Jahmyr Gibbs in, and it's not just one outlet saying it. It's becoming the consensus. Let's take a minute and really unpack why that McCaffrey comparison matters so much, because I think some casual fans hear it and just assume it means he's going to get a ton of carries. That's not really the point. The genius of the McCaffrey role isn't that he's just some bruising bell cow who runs the ball 40 times a game into a pile. It's that he's used intelligently. He's split out wide sometimes. He's running routes out of the slot. He's catching checkdowns. He's catching wheel routes. He's involved in the passing game as much as the running game, all while still getting a heavy dose of work between the tackles when the offense needs a tough yard. That is precisely the profile that fits Jahmyr Gibbs like a glove. This is a player who has shown he can line up anywhere and beat you any way you want. 20 touches a game, sprinkled with receptions, sprinkled with home run rushing attempts, sprinkled with matchup nightmares against slower linebackers who simply cannot keep up with him in open space. If the Lions actually deploy him that way for a full 16 or 17 games, we could be looking at a running back season that Detroit has never quite seen before, not even in the Barry Sanders era, just because of how the passing game adds a whole different dimension to the production. Now let's shift gears for a second and talk about that offensive line, because this has honestly been one of the most underappreciated storylines of the entire offseason, and it deserves way more attention than it's been getting. Everybody wants to talk about skill position players, and don't get me wrong, we just spent a solid chunk of this video doing exactly that. But championship football gets built in the trenches, and Detroit has quietly assembled one of the more fascinating offensive line reconstructions in recent memory. Let's start with a name that never gets enough shine: Tate Ratledge. This man was a rookie last year, thrown right into the fire after Kevin Zeitler departed. And while the start was admittedly a little bit rocky, by the end of the season, he was grading out as one of the better guards in the entire league. We're talking about a genuinely strong overall grade, one of the highest among offensive linemen league-wide, an even better run-blocking grade. And over his final 12 games of the season, this man allowed 0 sacks and only a small handful of quarterback hits. For a rookie guard, that is not just good for a rookie. That is good, period, full stop. And now heading into year 2, there is every reason to believe Ratledge takes another leap, and that should terrify opposing defensive coordinators. Then you've got the center position, where Detroit made a real change by bringing in Cade Mays. Mays grades out as a top 5 pass-protecting center over the past 2 seasons among qualifying players with significant offensive snaps. That's a serious upgrade at a position that had some inconsistency the year before. Add in first-round rookie Blake Miller stepping into the right tackle spot, a player who is absolutely dominant protecting the quarterback's blind side in college, allowing pressure on just 1.8% of his pass-blocking reps while manning the right side in college, NFL, and you start to see why people are genuinely excited about this group. And let's not forget the headline move of the entire offseason up front: Penei Sewell sliding over to left tackle after years of dominating on the right side, a transition that by all accounts has been described as seamless. When you combine an already elite talent like Sewell moving to protect Jared Goff's blind side, a former first-rounder like Miller taking over on the right, a legitimate center upgrade in Mays, and a pair of ascending young guards in Ratledge and Mahogany, that's not a weakness anymore. That is a legitimate strength, and it directly feeds into why people believe Gibbs can take that next leap into true superstardom. Now, is everything perfect? Of course not. And we'd be doing you a disservice if we pretended it was all sunshine and rainbows. There is real, legitimate uncertainty here, and most of it comes down to the defensive side of the ball. Detroit secondary took a hit this offseason after losing a key piece due to a serious off-field legal situation, and that leaves real questions in the cornerback room heading into training camp. On top of that, two of the team's best defensive playmakers are working their way back from significant injuries suffered late last season, and until we see them on the field in live action, there's simply no way to know for certain how effective they'll be. Dan Campbell has built his reputation on being one of the more aggressive, innovative minds in football when it comes to the offensive side of the ball, with trick plays and fourth down gambles that have become his signature. The question heading into this season is whether that same level of creativity and adaptability can translate over to a defense that desperately needs an identity. If Campbell and his defensive staff can find answers there, even partial ones, this team has all the pieces to make a real run. But here's the thing, and this is why today's news is so exciting. Even with those defensive question marks, the sheer talent that's been assembled on the offensive side of the ball might be enough to carry this team through the rough patches. When you have the number 1 overall fantasy player in football, a quarterback who has been a top 5 statistical performer at his position for 3 straight years running, a receiving core that includes one of the most consistent slot weapons in the league, a game-breaking deep threat, a promising young tight end room, and now suddenly a retooled, ascending offensive line up front. That's the recipe for an offense that can simply outscore its problems. And that's exactly the vision these two reports are painting. A Lions team that finished outside the playoff picture a year ago, that had one of those seasons where things just didn't bounce their way, could be sitting on the verge of a complete turnaround, powered by an easier schedule this time around, powered by internal improvement along that offensive line, and powered by unleashing Jahmyr Gibbs the way he was always meant to be used. So when you put it all together, Lions fans, this is about as good a 1-2 punch of news as you could ask for heading into the heart of the offseason. The best fantasy player in football wearing Honolulu blue. A national outlet putting Detroit at the top of the worst of first conversation. An offensive line quietly getting better in ways that don't always make the headlines but absolutely show up on Sundays. This team has all the ingredients, and now it's just about whether they can put it together for 60 minutes, week after week, and finally get back to where we all know this roster belongs. The pieces are there. The talent is undeniable. And if Jahmyr Gibbs really does turn into this generation's version of a McCaffrey-style workhorse, we might be talking about one of the most electric seasons a Lions running back has ever had. All right, that's going to do it for this one, but I want to hear from you down in the comments. Do you believe Jahmyr Gibbs can actually live up to being the number 1 overall fantasy player in football? Do you think this offensive line improvement is as real as it looks on paper? And most importantly, do you believe the Lions can actually go worst to first this season in one of the toughest divisions in the entire NFL? Drop your thoughts below. Let's get a conversation going because I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, do me a favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow more than you know. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another Lions update, because we have got so much more off-season coverage coming your way. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.